The metal handcuffs bit into my wrists as Sheriff Sheila Dawson slammed me against the hood of her cruiser. Blood trickled down my temple where she had struck me with her flashlight. The parking lot crowd stood frozen, watching in horror as she leaned close to my ear, her badge pressing painfully into my back. "I told you what would happen if you kept digging," she whispered, her voice like ice. "Nobody questions me in my town." My eyes met those of the terrified onlookers, good people who had lived under her shadow too long. Not one stepped forward. Not one dared speak. The deputy filmed everything on his body camera, but I knew that footage would mysteriously disappear tonight. "I found the files, Sheila," I said through gritted teeth. "About Sergeant Ray, about all of them." Her fingers tightened around my arm until I winced. The smirk on her face vanished, replaced by something dangerous, something afraid. "Take him to holding," she ordered the deputy. "No phone call, no visitors." As they dragged me toward the squad car, I realized with absolute clarity that I would not survive the night in Sheriff Sheila Dawson's jail. My name is Daniel Cooper. 4 months ago, I was just a man seeking peace. I had purchased a small patch of land on the outskirts of Millwood, a quiet town nestled in the Appalachian foothills. Nothing fancy, just 5 acres with an old farmhouse that needed work. The kind of place where a man could hear himself think. I drove an aging Ford pickup and owned a vintage Airstream camper that had belonged to my father. It was silver and beautiful, restored by my own hands over countless weekends. When I first arrived in Millwood, the house needed repairs before it was habitable, so I parked my camper on my own property. I had every legal right to do so. The land was mine. The paperwork was clear. The locals had warned me casually that Millwood took its ordinances seriously. "They are sticklers for the rules here," the man at the hardware store told me. "Sheriff runs a tight ship." I nodded politely but paid little attention. I had always been a law-abiding citizen. I kept to myself. I bothered no one. My first night in the camper was peaceful. The crickets sang me to sleep, and the distant hoot of an owl was the only disturbance. The air smelled clean, like pine and fresh soil. For the first time in years, my shoulders relaxed. I had escaped the noise and compression of city life. Here, I could breathe. At dawn, I woke to birdsong. The morning light filtered through the trees, dappling the ground with golden patches. I made coffee on my small stove and stepped outside to watch the mist rise off the distant hills. My soul felt at home here. This was where I belonged. It was when I moved toward my truck that I saw it. A bright orange citation flapping beneath the windshield wiper. My heart sank as I pulled it free. The paper read, "Violation of Ordinance 42B, Unauthorized Recreational Vehicle Dwelling." The fine was $500. I stood there stunned. No one had knocked on my door. No one had asked me to move my camper or explained any rule I might be breaking. There had been no warning, no conversation. Just this impersonal piece of paper demanding money. At the bottom of the citation was a signature that would soon become burned into my brain. Sheriff Sheila Dawson. "This must be a mistake," I said aloud to the empty morning air. I read the citation 3 times. The language was vague, referencing town codes I had never seen. The fine seemed excessive, punitive even for a first offense. And above all, the lack of human contact disturbed me. What kind of law enforcement issued tickets without even speaking to the person first? I folded the paper and tucked it into my pocket. My peaceful morning was shattered. My coffee grew cold in my hand. The warmth I had felt toward Millwood cooled considerably. I had been in town less than 48 hours, and already I felt unwelcome. "Well, Sheriff Sheila Dawson," I muttered, "I suppose we need to have a conversation." I had no idea then how that conversation would change everything. I had no concept of the storm I was walking into. That orange ticket was not just a citation. It was the first shot in a war I never asked to fight. A war against a woman who had turned a sheriff's badge into a weapon. The Millwood Courthouse was a sturdy brick building with white columns that spoke of a more dignified era. American flags flanked the entrance, and the steps were worn smooth by decades of footsteps. I climbed those steps with the confidence of someone who believed in reason and fair process. My naivete seems almost laughable to me now. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of old paper and floor polish. The hallway echoed with my footsteps as I approached the clerk's office. A middle-aged woman with glasses perched on her nose looked up as I entered. "May I help you?" she asked, her voice pleasant but reserved. I placed the ticket on the counter between us. "I would like to contest this citation. I received it this morning without any warning or explanation." The clerk picked up the orange paper. Her eyes flicked to the signature and something subtle changed in her expression. A tightening around the mouth. A slight withdrawal. "Sheriff Dawson issued this herself," she said. "It was not a question." "Yes," I replied. "Is there a process for contesting it? I had no idea I was violating any ordinance." The clerk glanced around, though we were alone in the office. She leaned forward slightly and lowered her voice. "Listen, I cannot tell you what to do, but Sheila does not lose. Not ever." Her words caught me off guard, not the sheriff, not Sheriff Dawson, Sheila, spoken with a familiarity tinged with fear. "Surely there is an appeals process," I pressed. "This is clearly excessive for a first offense." She slid a form across the counter. "Fill this out if you want to contest it, but between you and me, most people just pay." As I took the form, her fingers brushed mine. She held my gaze for a moment longer than necessary. "Be careful," she whispered. I completed the paperwork, trying to ignore the unease growing in my stomach. As I turned to leave, the clerk called after me. "Court date will be mailed to you. Good luck." Outside in the hallway, an elderly man with stooped shoulders watched me exit the clerk's office. He wore overalls and a flannel shirt despite the warm day. His eyes were sharp in a weathered face. "You must be new," he said, his voice a gravelly rumble. I stopped, surprised by the direct address. "Just moved in this week." He nodded toward the paper in my hand. "Sheila got you already, did she?" "Is she always this welcoming to newcomers?" I asked. The old man gave a dry chuckle with no humor in it. "Sheila welcomes nobody. She monitors, she controls." He gestured for me to follow him to a wooden bench against the wall. We sat, and he lowered his voice. "Name is Frank. Had the auto shop here for 40 years before I retired. Seen 3 sheriffs come and go, none like her." "What makes her different?" I asked. Frank rubbed his chin. "The others wore the badge to protect the town. Sheila wears it like a crown. You question the queen, you pay the price." "That cannot be legal," I protested. "Legal?" Frank snorted. "Let me tell you about legal. 3 years back, my grandson left his truck parked overnight downtown. Engine trouble. Got 6 tickets by morning. When he went to argue, Sheila had his license suspended for unpaid violations. Then searched his truck for cause and found a hunting knife. Charged him with carrying a concealed weapon." My blood ran cold. "That sounds like harassment." "That sounds like Sheila," Frank corrected. "The judge is her golf partner. The mayor is her second cousin. The newspaper might as well be printed in her office." "Nobody stops her?" I asked. Frank looked at me with something between pity and warning. "Last deputy who tried found himself arrested for evidence tampering. Charges were dropped eventually, but his career was over. His reputation ruined. He stood with effort, joints cracking. "You seem like a decent fellow. Pay the ticket, keep your head down, or better yet, find another town." I watched him shuffle away, his warning hanging in the air between us. As I exited the courthouse, the bright sunlight did nothing to warm the chill that had settled in my bones. I had come to Millwood seeking peace and simplicity. Instead, I had stumbled into the territory of a predator. I did not realize then that I had already been marked. Sheriff Sheila Dawson did not tolerate questions, and I had just asked several. In her mind, that made me an enemy, and enemies of the sheriff did not fare well in Millwood. The next morning dawned with a heavy mist clinging to the ground. I had spent a restless night turning over Frank's warnings in my mind. Part of me wanted to dismiss his words as small-town exaggeration. The other part, the part that had seen too much of the world to be naive, knew better. I made coffee and stepped outside to assess the progress I had made on the house renovations. The porch still needed work, but the interior was coming along nicely. In a month, maybe less, I could move out of the camper and into my real home. The sight of another bright orange paper attached to my front door stopped me cold. My coffee sloshed over the rim of my mug as I hurried forward. This citation was different. Violation of Building Code 15C, unauthorized structure. The fine was $750. My garden shed. They were fining me for the small prefabricated shed I had assembled 2 days ago to store my tools. It sat on a concrete pad that had been there for decades. There was no possible code violation. As I stood staring at this new ticket, a patrol car crawled down my long gravel driveway. The vehicle moved slowly, deliberately, like a predator. Behind the wheel sat a woman in a khaki uniform, aviator sunglasses hiding her eyes. Her brown hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her face was a mask of professional detachment. "Sheriff Sheila Dawson." She did not stop. She did not speak. She simply drove past my house at walking speed, her head turning to maintain eye contact with me through her tinted windows. The message was clear as summer lightning. "I see you. I am watching you." The patrol car disappeared around the bend, but the weight of her presence remained. This was not law enforcement. This was intimidation. That afternoon, my phone rang. It was Harold Fisher, the elderly man who owned the neighboring property and had sold me my parcel. "Daniel," he said, his voice strained, "I got a call from the county, something about your land being improperly zoned." My grip tightened on the phone. "That is ridiculous. We checked all the paperwork before I bought it." "I know, son, but they are saying there might be issues with your residency status, something about permits for the renovations." "Harold, what is really going on here?" I asked directly. A long silence followed. Then, in a lower voice, "I got a visit from Sheriff Dawson this morning. She mentioned concerns about your property, suggested I might face fines if I had knowingly sold improperly zoned land." The pieces clicked into place. "She is pressuring you." Another pause. "Daniel, I cannot afford trouble. I am on a fixed income." "I understand, Harold," I said, though fury burned in my chest. "This is not your fight." After hanging up, I drove into town to pick up additional supplies. When I returned 3 hours later, I found my truck had been keyed. A long, deliberate scratch running the entire length of the driver's side. The damage would cost thousands to repair. I immediately called the sheriff's office to report the vandalism. The deputy who answered sounded bored. "Any witnesses?" he asked. "No," I admitted, "but it happened in broad daylight. Someone must have seen something." "We will file a report," he said without enthusiasm. "But without evidence, there is not much we can do." I requested a deputy come take photographs. The response was a non-committal when someone is available. No one ever came. 3 days later, I called to check on the status of my report. The deputy on the line had no record of my call. My report had vanished, or more likely, it had never been filed at all. That night, I sat on my porch steps watching the fireflies rise from the grass. The beauty of this place remained, but it was now tainted by an ugly reality. Sheriff Sheila Dawson was not just a strict law enforcement officer. She was using her badge as a weapon, targeting me for reasons I could not fathom. "Why me?" I whispered to the darkness. But I knew the answer. I had questioned her authority. I had not immediately bowed to her power. In her world, that made me a threat, and threats were to be eliminated. As the moon rose over the trees, I made a decision. I would not run. This was my home now. I had invested my savings, my labor, my hopes in this place. If Sheriff Dawson wanted a war, she would find I was not an easy target. What I did not know then, what I could not have known, was just how deep her corruption ran and how dangerous she would become when truly challenged. The public library in Millwood was a small building with large windows, and that particular hush that seems universal to all libraries. The elderly librarian, Ms. Winters, peered at me over half-moon glasses as I requested access to town records and back issues of the local newspaper. "Research project," I explained vaguely. "The archives are in the basement," she said. "Light switch is on the left, close up when you finish." The basement smelled of dust and old paper. Metal shelves lined the walls, filled with bound newspapers and municipal records. I started with the most recent and worked backward. Sheriff Sheila Dawson had held her position for 6 years. Before that, she had been a deputy under Sheriff Gordon Tate, who retired due to health issues. What struck me first was the pattern of complaints that appeared briefly in the newspaper, then vanished without resolution. A local business owner questioned excessive parking enforcement, then 2 weeks later sold his shop and moved away. A high school teacher filed a complaint about a warrantless search of student vehicles, then retracted it with a public apology. No explanations, no follow-up. I copied dates, names, case numbers. I photographed articles with my phone. After 4 hours, my eyes burned from strain, but I had established a clear pattern of behavior. Sheila Dawson did not just enforce the law, she weaponized it against anyone who challenged her. The next day, I drove to the county courthouse, 30 miles away in Ridgemont. Here, I had more luck accessing sealed records. Not all were available to the public, but the clerk was more forthcoming than those in Millwood. "Sheriff Dawson," she said when I mentioned the name. "We get a lot of cases from her jurisdiction. Most never go to trial." "Why is that?" I asked. "Plea deals," she said. "Always plea deals." I requested records of all cases originating from Millwood over the past 5 years. The pattern was striking. Arrests followed by dropped charges. Minor infractions escalated to serious charges, then resolved with hefty fines rather than court appearances. The justice system reduced to a revenue stream. My breakthrough came unexpectedly at a small diner off the highway. I sat alone, reviewing my notes, when a man slid into the booth across from me. "You are asking questions about Sheriff Dawson," he said without preamble. I tensed, ready for another threat. "And you are?" "Ben Nichols, former deputy, very former. He was in his 30s with close-cropped hair and tired eyes. Saw you at the courthouse yesterday." "I am just trying to understand how things work around here," I said carefully. Ben gave a humorless laugh. "They work exactly how Sheila wants them to work." He ordered coffee, then leaned forward. I lasted 8 months in her department, came in idealistic, left with an ulcer and a reputation she made sure followed me to 3 counties. What happened? Ben stared into his coffee. I questioned her methods, specifically how she handled a homeless veteran who lived in his car. My pulse quickened. Tell me. His name was Ray Garson, Sergeant, U.S. Army, 2 tour in Afghanistan, came home with PTSD and eventually ended up living in his car. Kept it clean, parked legally, never bothered anyone. Let me guess, I said. Sheila ticketed him. Ben nodded. Daily, parking violations, vagrancy, you name it. He could not pay, so the fines doubled. His car got towed. He lost everything he owned. That is cruel, but not necessarily criminal, I pointed out. I am not finished, Ben said. Ray filed a complaint with the state police. The next day, Sheila arrested him for trespassing. I was on duty when she brought him in. No paperwork, no Miranda rights. She put him in holding overnight. Ben's hands tightened around his mug. In the morning, he was gone. Sheila said he had been transferred to county. County had no record of him. His case file disappeared from our system. A chill ran through me. What are you saying? I am saying Ray Garson vanished, Ben replied. And when I pushed for answers, Sheila fabricated evidence that I had stolen drugs from the evidence room. It was her word against mine. Did you report this? I asked. To whom? The state police. They work with her daily. The FBI, with what proof? Everything disappeared, records altered, witnesses suddenly unable to remember details. I processed this information in silence. This went beyond harassment, beyond corruption. This was systematic abuse of power at a level that seemed almost unbelievable. Why are you telling me this? I finally asked. Because you are still here, Ben said simply. Most people who cross Sheila either pay up or leave town. You are doing neither. That makes you either very brave or very stupid. Maybe both, I admitted. If you are serious about standing up to her, you need evidence. Solid, irrefutable evidence. Ben slid a napkin across the table with his phone number. And you need to be careful, document everything. Keep backups away from your property. Trust nobody in town. As Ben stood to leave, he paused. One more thing. Whatever you do, do not let her catch you alone. Sheila does not lose, ever. She makes problems disappear. After he left, I sat for a long time, turning over his words. The story of Sergeant Ray haunted me. How many others had suffered under Sheila's reign? How many had lost homes, livelihoods, freedom? That night, I began methodically documenting everything. I installed security cameras around my property. I backed up all my research to cloud storage. I started a journal with times, dates, and detailed accounts of every interaction. This was no longer about fighting unfair tickets. This was about exposing a cancer that had grown unchecked in this community for years. Sheriff Sheila Dawson had built her power on fear and silence, but I was not afraid, and I would not be silenced. The Millwood Diner sat on Main Street, a chrome-trimmed establishment with red vinyl booths and waitresses who called everyone honey. It was the beating heart of local gossip, the place where the town's social fabric was woven daily over eggs and coffee. I chose a booth near the back, spread out my notes, and waited. I had placed a small advertisement in the classified section of the weekly newspaper, concerned about local law enforcement practices. Let us talk. Millwood Diner, Tuesday, 2 p.m. It was a risk. Sheila would see it. She would know. But I needed witnesses, people willing to speak on record. Without them, I had suspicions but little admissible evidence. At 2 o'clock sharp, the bell over the door jingled. An elderly woman entered, looked around nervously, then approached my table. "Are you the one from the paper?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded and gestured to the seat across from me. "Thank you for coming. May I ask your name?" "Margaret Wilkins. I owned the flower shop until last year." She glanced toward the windows repeatedly as she spoke. "I am probably making a mistake coming here." "I appreciate your courage, Mrs. Wilkins," I said. "I am trying to understand how Sheriff Dawson operates in this town." Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she arranged her purse on her lap. "My shop was on Main Street for 32 years. Never had a problem until 3 years ago. Sheriff started ticketing my delivery van. Said it was commercial vehicle on a residential street, even though I lived above my shop." "What happened?" I prompted when she fell silent. "Fines I could not pay. Then inspections found violations that would cost thousands to fix. Then customers stopped coming." Her eyes welled with tears. "Sheriff told people my flowers carried mites, ruined my reputation. I finally sold for a quarter of what the business was worth." Before I could respond, a middle-aged man slid into the booth beside Margaret. "Jim Carlson," he introduced himself. "Heard you asking questions." Over the next hour, 3 more people joined us. Each had a story. Jim lost his contracting license after arguing with Sheila over a ticket. A young woman named Sarah was arrested for disorderly conduct after recording a deputy questioning teenagers. A retired teacher, Mr. Peterson, found his water mysteriously shut off after writing a letter to the editor questioning the sheriff's budget. But as revealing as their stories were, none would go on record. None would sign statements or speak to a lawyer. "You do not understand," Jim said when I pressed him. "She does not just have a badge. She has eyes everywhere. The dispatcher is her niece. The mayor owes her for covering up his son's DUI. Half the deputies are related to her by blood or marriage. The entire system is compromised," I stated flatly. 5 heads nodded in unison. "What about the local newspaper?" I asked. "Surely they would investigate corruption." Sarah gave a bitter laugh. "The Millwood Sentinel. The editor plays poker with Sheila every Thursday. Besides, they fired their investigative reporter 2 years ago. Now it is just church socials and high school sports." As our meeting concluded, I felt a mixture of validation and frustration. I had confirmation that Sheila's abuse was widespread, but no one brave enough to stand with me officially. "Be careful," Margaret whispered as she prepared to leave. "There are cameras on the traffic lights. She will know who came here today." After they departed, I remained at the booth, nursing a cold coffee. The waitress approached to refill my cup, then hesitated. "I could not help overhearing," she said softly, "about the sheriff." I looked up hopeful. "Do you have information?" She glanced around, then placed a napkin on my table. "My brother worked dispatch, overhead things about a homeless veteran who vanished." My heart raced. "Ray Garson." She nodded once sharply. "Never write my name down." Then she walked away, leaving the napkin with a scrawled address. That evening, I drove to the address, a small house on the outskirts of town. The man who answered the door had the weary look of someone who had seen too much. "You are the one asking about Sheila," he said, "not a question." "And you know something about Ray Garson," I replied. He ushered me inside quickly, checking the street before closing the door. "I worked dispatch the night Ray disappeared. The official record says he was transferred to county lockup, but no transport vehicle was ever logged out." "Where did he go?" I asked. The man's face paled. "Sheila took him herself. Late night, no paperwork. He never arrived at county. 3 days later, his belongings were cleared from the evidence room. "Did you report this?" "To who?" he snapped. "The state police captain plays golf with Sheila every Sunday. The county judge dismisses any complaint against her. The FBI would need evidence I do not have." I processed this information in silence. The implications were horrifying. This went beyond corruption. This suggested something far darker. "Why are you telling me this now?" I finally asked. He stared at me with hollow eyes. "Because someone needs to stop her, and you are either brave enough or foolish enough to try." As I drove home through the gathering darkness, the weight of what I had learned pressed down on me. Sheila Dawson had not just built a system of corruption, she had constructed an empire of fear. The town was trapped in a web of silence, each person too afraid to be the first to speak out. I had come to Millwood seeking peace. Instead, I had found a community crying silently for justice. These people needed someone to stand up, someone who had nothing to lose, someone like me. By the time I reached my property, my resolve had hardened like steel. This was no longer just my fight. It was a fight for every person Sheila had bullied, threatened, or silenced. For Sergeant Ray, wherever he might be. For a town living under the shadow of a badge twisted by power. The war had begun, and I was ready. The following Tuesday, I drove into town for supplies. My truck needed oil, and the local hardware store had finally received the lumber for my porch repairs. The morning air held the promise of spring, birds singing in the roadside trees. For a moment, I allowed myself to feel hopeful. That hope shattered when flashing lights appeared in my rearview mirror. A patrol car followed close behind me, light bar pulsing. I checked my speedometer exactly at the limit. My turn signals worked. My registration was current. Still, I pulled to the shoulder, my heart hammering against my ribs. The cruiser stopped behind me. Through the mirror, I recognized Sheriff Sheila Dawson herself stepping out, sunglasses reflecting the morning sun. A younger deputy emerged from the passenger side, already recording with a body camera. I rolled down my window and placed my hands visibly on the steering wheel. The sheriff approached with measured steps, her hand resting on her holstered weapon. "License and registration," she demanded without preamble. "May I ask why I was pulled over, Sheriff?" I kept my voice level despite my racing pulse. "License and registration first," she repeated, her tone flat. I nodded and reached slowly toward the glove compartment. "I am getting my registration from the glove box," I narrated clearly, remembering Ben's warnings about being alone with her. "Step out of the vehicle now," Sheila suddenly shouted, drawing her weapon. What? I was just out of the vehicle, hands where I can see them. Confusion and fear collided in my chest as I complied, stepping slowly from my truck with hands raised. The deputy moved closer, still filming. "Turn around, hands behind your back," Sheriff Dawson ordered. "Sheriff, I have done nothing wrong," I protested, though I turned as instructed. "You were reaching for a weapon," she stated loudly, clearly for the deputy's camera. "I was reaching for my registration, as you requested," I countered, my voice steady despite my racing heart. Cold handcuffs snapped around my wrists with unnecessary force. "Daniel Cooper, you are under arrest for interfering with an officer in the performance of her duties." A small crowd had gathered on the sidewalk. The hardware store owner stood in his doorway. An elderly couple froze mid-crossing. Children on bicycles stopped to stare, all witnesses to my humiliation. Sheila leaned close to my ear, her voice low enough that the body camera would not catch her words. "I warned you to leave town. You decided to poke the bear instead." She led me to her cruiser with theatrical care, making a show of protecting my head as she guided me into the back seat. As the door slammed shut, I caught her smile, small, satisfied, victorious. The ride to the station passed in silence. Through the partition, I watched the back of her head, the rigid posture of someone accustomed to being obeyed. She had orchestrated this perfectly, a public arrest, a trumped-up charge, the ultimate show of power. The booking process was deliberately slow. Fingerprints, photographs, personal items cataloged and placed in a plastic bin. Throughout it all, Sheila watched from her office, visible through the glass partition, occasionally speaking on her phone. My cell was bare concrete with a metal bench and toilet. Hours passed without information or contact. Through the small window in the door, I could see deputies passing, avoiding eye contact. Night fell, and with it came the realization that no one outside knew where I was. Around midnight, the cell door opened. A deputy I had not seen before slid a tray of food inside. "Eat up," he said without emotion. "When will I see a judge?" I asked. "Tomorrow, maybe. I get a phone call." The deputy hesitated, glancing down the corridor. "Sheriff says all communications equipment is down tonight. Technical issue. Nothing to be done." I recognized the lie, but also the fear behind it. This man was another puppet on Sheila's strings. After he left, a voice came from the adjacent cell. First time in Sheila's special suite. I moved closer to the wall. "Who is there?" "Name is Mac. Been here 3 days for public intoxication. Funny thing is, I have not had a drink in 12 years. "Why are you still here?" I asked. Laughter, dry and humorless. "Court clerk keeps misplacing my paperwork. Happens when you own the land Sheila's brother wants to buy cheap." We talked in whispers through the night. Mac told me about others who had occupied these cells, small offenses blown into major charges, evidence appearing from nowhere, confessions signed under duress. "Word of advice," Mac said as dawn approached. "Take whatever deal they offer tomorrow, pay whatever fine, then get out of Millwood as fast as you can." "I cannot do that," I replied. "Then you are either crazy or the bravest fool I have met," Mac whispered. "She does not forgive and she does not forget." Morning brought a court appearance via video link. The judge, the same golf partner Frank had mentioned, read the charges without looking at the camera. My court-appointed attorney advised accepting a plea, guilty to a reduced charge of disorderly conduct, $500 fine, time served. "This is absurd," I protested quietly. "There was no crime." "Take the deal," my attorney muttered. "Trust me." I almost did. The path of least resistance beckoned: pay the fine, end the nightmare, drive away from Millwood forever. It would have been the sensible choice. But as I stood before that camera, with Sheriff Sheila Dawson watching from the corner of the room, something hardened inside me. A resolve crystallized from anger and injustice. "Not guilty," I stated clearly. "I request a formal trial." The judge frowned, the attorney sighed, and Sheila smiled, because now she had me exactly where she wanted me, tangled in her web of corrupted justice. But what she did not realize was that sometimes the prey becomes the hunter. I walked out of that jail the next morning on bail, more determined than I had ever been. This was no longer about tickets or harassment. This was about justice, not just for me, but for everyone who had suffered under her reign. Freedom tasted sweet after 24 hours in a concrete cell. The morning air, the bird song, the simple act of walking without supervision, gifts I had taken for granted before. But freedom came with the heavy knowledge that it was temporary. Sheriff Sheila Dawson had marked me for destruction. I called Ben Nichols from a gas station payphone, not trusting my cell phone. We agreed to meet at a diner 30 miles outside town, far from Sheila's surveillance network. The roadside restaurant was a nondescript building with an empty parking lot. Ben sat in a corner booth, nursing a coffee. His posture stiffened when I slid into the seat across from him. "You look like hell," he observed. "Spent the night in Sheila's accommodations," I replied. Ben pushed his coffee aside. "I warned you she plays dirty. And now I have experienced it firsthand." I leaned forward. "I need your help, Ben, not just information now. I need to build a case that will stand up in court." "You are talking about going after her legally, after everything I told you about how she controls the system." "Not the local system," I clarified. "We need to build a case strong enough to take to the state authorities, too big for her to bury." Ben studied me for a long moment. "You are either the bravest or the stupidest man I have met." "So I have been told." The ghost of a smile crossed his face. "What exactly are you proposing?" "A civil rights case," I explained. "Documented evidence of systematic abuse of power, harassment, and corruption. But we need witnesses, real testimony, not just rumors." "People are scared," Ben reminded me. "We protect their identities until the case is solid. Anonymous affidavits to start." Ben drummed his fingers on the table, thinking. "I might know a few deputies who would talk if they knew they were protected. Guys who joined to serve the community, not to be Sheila's enforcers." "Good. We also need documents, ticket records, arrest reports, complaint logs." "Those would be in the sheriff's department database." "Can you access them?" Ben hesitated. "Not directly, but I know someone in records who owes me a favor." Over the next 2 weeks, we worked in the shadows. Ben reached out to former colleagues who had left the department under Sheila's reign. I meticulously organized every piece of evidence, every testimonial, every document smuggled out of the records department. We created copies, stored them in multiple locations. Nothing could be lost. Nothing could be traced back to our sources. The breakthrough came when Ben arrived at our meeting place with a flash drive in his hand. His eyes were bright with triumph. "Dashcam footage," he announced quietly. "From Sergeant Miller's patrol car. He saved it before Sheila could erase it." We watched the video on my laptop. It showed Sheriff Dawson conducting a traffic stop, then planting evidence in the vehicle while the driver was handcuffed outside. Clear, irrefutable proof of corruption. "This is it," I breathed. "This is what we needed." "There is more," Ben said. "I found someone who worked in the records department last year. She has screenshots of Sheila deleting ticket logs, changing reports, and 3 deputies are willing to testify about being ordered to target specific individuals." Our case was building, but we needed legal expertise, someone beyond Sheila's influence. "I know a lawyer," Ben suggested. "Julia Mercer, works in Henderson County. She specializes in civil rights cases, and she hates corrupt cops more than anyone I know." Julia Mercer's office was 2 counties away, a small practice above a bakery. The woman herself was in her 50s, with silver-streaked hair and penetrating eyes that missed nothing. "Ben says you are taking on the Queen of Millwood," she said after we were introduced. "Someone has to," I replied. She gestured to the stack of evidence we had brought. "May I?" For an hour she examined our materials in silence. Occasionally she made notes or asked for clarification. When she finally looked up, her expression was grave. "This is bigger than harassment," she said. "These patterns suggest systematic civil rights violations, witness intimidation, evidence tampering. possibly even criminal misconduct. "Will you help us?" I asked. Julia removed her glasses. "Officially, no. My name cannot appear on any documents yet. Sheriff Dawson has friends in the state attorney's office, but unofficially, I will guide you through every step." With Julia's expertise, we prepared a civil lawsuit alleging violations of constitutional rights. We gathered sworn statements from 27 individuals, all protected by anonymity for now. We documented patterns of abuse spanning Sheriff Dawson's entire tenure. When the case was ready, Julia reviewed the final documents. "This is solid," she confirmed. "But filing it will put a target on your back. Sheila will come at you with everything she has." "She already is," I pointed out. "Not like this. This is declaring war." I thought of Sergeant Ray, who vanished for challenging her. Of Mac, still sitting in a cell for land his family had owned for generations. Of the fear that permeated every corner of Millwood. "The papers need to be served directly to her," Julia explained. "Are you sure you want to be the one to do it?" "I am sure," I said without hesitation. 2 days later, I walked into the sheriff's department. The deputy at the front desk recognized me immediately, his eyes widening. "I need to see Sheriff Dawson," I stated calmly. "She is busy," he stammered. "Tell her Daniel Cooper is here with legal documents that require her personal receipt." Minutes later, I stood in Sheila's office. She sat behind her desk, seemingly relaxed, but I noticed the tension in her shoulders, the tightness around her eyes. "Mr. Cooper," she said coolly, "brave of you to come here." "Sheriff Dawson," I replied, placing the thick envelope on her desk. "You have been served with a civil lawsuit alleging violations of constitutional rights, abuse of power, harassment, and corruption. You have 30 days to respond." For a moment, just a moment, shock registered on her face. Then her mask of authority returned. She picked up the envelope, weighing it in her hand. "You have no idea what you have just done," she said softly. "Actually, Sheriff," I answered, meeting her gaze, "I think for the first time since I came to Millwood, I know exactly what I am doing." I turned and walked out, feeling her eyes burning into my back. The war was now in the open, and there would be no retreat. The Millwood County Courthouse stood like a monument to faded glory, its stone facade weathered by decades of rain and sun. On the morning of the hearing, people gathered on the steps and lawn, more than I had ever seen in town at once. Word had spread. This was not just a court case. This was a reckoning. Julia Mercer had officially taken the case after we filed, her ethical compass overriding her initial caution. She met me at the courthouse steps, looking sharp in a charcoal suit. "Ready?" she asked. "As I will ever be," I replied. Inside, the courtroom filled quickly. Farmers in clean shirts sat beside business owners in their Sunday best. Teachers, mechanics, retirees, the cross-section of a town holding its collective breath. They sat in rigid silence, eyes forward, as if afraid to be seen showing interest. At precisely 9 o'clock, Sheriff Sheila Dawson entered through a side door. She wore her full uniform, badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Her face betrayed nothing as she took her seat beside her attorney, a slick man in an expensive suit, imported talent from the state capitol. Judge Hamilton entered, and the room rose. This was not Sheila's golf partner. Our case had been assigned to a visiting judge from the next county, a small victory arranged through Julia's connections. "This preliminary hearing will determine if there is sufficient cause to proceed with the civil case of Cooper versus Dawson," Judge Hamilton announced. "Ms. Mercer, you may begin your presentation." Julia approached the bench with quiet confidence. "Your Honor, This case concerns the systematic abuse of authority by Sheriff Sheila Dawson against citizens of Millwood County. We have documented evidence of constitutional violations, harassment, selective enforcement, and witness intimidation. She methodically presented our evidence, the ticket patterns, the testimonials, the missing complaints. Then came the video footage from Sergeant Miller's dashcam, playing on the courtroom monitor. The audience gasped audibly as they watched Sheriff Dawson plant evidence in a suspect's vehicle. "This is not an isolated incident," Julia continued. "This represents a pattern of behavior that has terrorized this community for years." As witnesses took the stand, the courtroom atmosphere shifted. Ben testified about the pressure to falsify reports. A former clerk described seeing tickets being added to the system after the fact. Each testimony built upon the last, creating a comprehensive picture of corruption. Throughout it all, Sheila maintained her composure, occasionally whispering to her attorney. But I noticed the sweat at her temples, the tight grip she kept on her pen. When her attorney cross-examined our witnesses, he focused on technicalities, challenging chain of custody, questioning motivations, attempting to discredit rather than disprove. But the evidence was too consistent, the pattern too clear. After the lunch recess, it was Sheila's turn to testify. She took the stand with practiced authority, swearing to tell the truth with a steady voice. "Sheriff Dawson," her attorney began, "how do you respond to these allegations?" "They are false," she stated flatly. "Mr. Cooper has orchestrated a campaign to discredit me because he refuses to abide by town ordinances. The witnesses against me are individuals with grudges, former employees who could not meet department standards, citizens angry about receiving valid citations." Her testimony continued in the same vein: denials, alternative explanations, attacks on credibility. She had an answer for everything. The video was doctored, the records were clerical errors, the testimonials were coordinated lies. Then Julia rose for cross-examination. "Sheriff Dawson, can you explain why complaints against you mysteriously disappear from county records?" "Filing errors happen in any office," Sheila replied smoothly. "All 23 complaints we documented, all filing errors." "I cannot speak to records I have not personally reviewed." Julia approached with a document. "This is a sworn statement from Deputy Keegan stating you ordered him to destroy complaint forms. Is that also a filing error?" For the first time, Sheila hesitated. Deputy Keegan was terminated for substance abuse. His testimony is suspect. "Interesting, because we have his personnel file showing exemplary service until he filed a report questioning your conduct, after which suddenly allegations of substance abuse appeared." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Sheila's attorney objected, but the damage was done. Cracks were showing in her armor. Julia continued methodically, point by point dismantling Sheila's defenses. With each exchange, the sheriff's responses grew more defensive, her explanations more convoluted. When confronted with ticket statistics showing her disproportionate targeting of certain individuals, she stumbled over her words. "These are merely coincidences," she insisted, but her voice had lost its certainty. By the end of the day, the mood in the courtroom had transformed. People who had entered fearful now sat forward in their seats. Whispers circulated. Someone even dared to shake my hand during a recess. As the hearing concluded, Judge Hamilton adjusted his glasses. "Having reviewed the evidence presented, I find sufficient cause to refer this matter to the State Judicial Ethics Committee and the Attorney General's office for further investigation. Additionally, I am issuing an order temporarily suspending Sheriff Dawson from active duty pending resolution of these serious allegations." The gavel fell with finality. Sheila's face drained of color. Her attorney immediately began arguing for a stay of the suspension, but Judge Hamilton had made his decision. As the courtroom emptied, I caught Sheila's eye across the room. For a moment her mask dropped completely, revealing raw fury, and beneath it fear. For perhaps the first time in her career, Sheriff Sheila Dawson was facing something she could not control. Outside, Julia squeezed my shoulder. "This is just the beginning," she cautioned. "The state investigation will take time, and Sheila still has allies." But as we walked down the courthouse steps, something unprecedented happened. People approached us, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. They offered handshakes, quiet thanks, stories they had been too afraid to tell before. Frank, the retired mechanic who had first warned me about Sheila, waited by my truck. "Never thought I would see this day," he said, his eyes damp. "You did what none of us dared." "It is not over," I reminded him. "No," he agreed, "but for the first time in years we can see the end coming." State investigators arrived in Millwood 3 days after the hearing. They came without fanfare, 4 serious men and women in suits, carrying badges from the Attorney General's office. They set up in a vacant office across from the Sheriff's Department, their presence a silent statement that the old rules no longer applied. I watched from across the street as they entered the Sheriff's Department, carrying subpoenas for records and interviews. Through the windows, I could see the deputies' nervous movements, the hurried conversations. The kingdom was under siege. By the second day, rumors spread through town. Deputies were being questioned one by one. File cabinets were being emptied, computers confiscated. Phones rang constantly at the local diner, the grocery store, the barber shop, anywhere people gathered to whisper about the unfolding drama. "Hayes turned," Ben told me during our daily meeting. Hayes had been Sheila's second-in-command, a loyal enforcer of her policies. Offered up everything for immunity, said she had them destroying evidence for years. "What kind of evidence?" I asked. "Complaint forms, altered reports, dashcam footage that contradicted official statements." Ben leaned closer. "And records about missing persons." My blood chilled. "Sergeant Ray." Ben nodded grimly. "And others, people who stood up to her and then conveniently disappeared. Hayes says he does not know what happened to them, but he knows Sheila kept separate files, files that are now missing." On the 4th day, the news broke officially. The state attorney general held a press conference on the courthouse steps. Cameras from regional news stations captured the moment. "Following our preliminary investigation, we have found substantial evidence of misconduct within the Millwood Sheriff's Department. Sheriff Sheila Dawson has been suspended from all duties pending criminal charges. The department will be under state supervision until further notice." The list of charges was extensive: official misconduct, evidence tampering, witness intimidation, civil rights violations, abuse of power. Each count was another nail in the coffin of Sheila's career. That evening I sat at the local diner, the same place where frightened townsfolk had once whispered warnings to me. The atmosphere had transformed. People talked openly, laughed freely. The weight of fear had lifted, not completely but noticeably. "Mr. Cooper," a young woman approached my table. I recognized her as a reporter from the Millwood Sentinel, the same paper that had refused to run my story weeks earlier. "Would you be willing to give an interview about how you stood up to Sheriff Dawson?" The irony was not lost on me. "Why now?" I asked. She had the grace to look embarrassed. "Management has changed their position on covering local law enforcement. I agreed to the interview, not out of vanity, but because the story needed telling. People needed to understand how fragile justice could be, how easily power could corrupt when left unchecked. The next morning, my phone rang constantly. More reporters, neighbors, even the mayor's office requesting meetings. Ben warned me to be careful. Sheila may be down, but she is not out, he cautioned. She still has friends in high places. His warning proved prescient. That afternoon, my landlord called with news that someone had broken into my house during my absence. Nothing was stolen, but my research materials were scattered, my computer smashed. A warning, or perhaps a desperate search for something incriminating. But it was too late for such tactics. The evidence was secure, copies stored with Julia and with state investigators. The truth was in the open now, spreading like wildfire through official channels and small-town gossip alike. By the end of the week, the transformation of Millwood was remarkable. Deputies who had once harassed citizens now performed their duties with careful correctness under state supervision. The courthouse clerk who had warned me that Sheila does not lose now processed paperwork efficiently, without fearful glances over her shoulder. Most telling was the change in ordinary citizens. People who had hunched their shoulders and averted their eyes when passing the sheriff's department now walked upright. Conversations in public places no longer dropped to whispers when certain topics arose. At the diner, Frank hailed me from his usual booth. "The outsider who stayed," he called me, loud enough for others to hear. It was a title spoken with respect now. "Just a man who believes in justice," I replied, sliding into the seat across from him. "You gave this town back its voice," Frank said, his weathered hands wrapped around his coffee mug. "People are coming forward now, telling their stories, things Sheila did that none of us dared speak about." "It should not have taken an outsider," I observed. Frank nodded solemnly. "Fear is a powerful thing. It seeps into your bones until standing tall seems impossible." "And now?" "Now," he smiled, revealing tobacco-stained teeth, "we remember what it means to be free." As I left the diner, a deputy passed me on the sidewalk. Instead of the intimidating stare I had grown accustomed to, he gave me a respectful nod. Small gestures, but they signaled a fundamental shift in the balance of power. The badge now served the people, not the other way around. 6 months passed like the changing of seasons, gradually, then suddenly complete. Millwood transformed from a town paralyzed by fear to a community healing from old wounds. The state investigation expanded, uncovering layers of corruption that shocked even those who had lived under Sheila's shadow for years. The formal indictment came down on a crisp autumn morning. Sheriff Sheila Dawson faced 27 criminal counts: official misconduct, evidence tampering, witness intimidation, civil rights violations, and abuse of power. The state attorney general held another press conference, this one attended by national media. "This case represents one of the most extensive abuses of law enforcement authority we have encountered," he declared. "No one is above the law, especially those entrusted to uphold it." The trial was moved to the state capitol, away from any lingering influence Sheila might have in the local system. Julia kept me updated on the proceedings, which I followed from a distance. My role as the initial plaintiff meant I would eventually testify, but for now, I focused on rebuilding my life in Millwood. My renovation work on the old farmhouse progressed steadily. The porch was finished, sturdy and welcoming. Inside, fresh paint and refinished floors transformed the space. I planted a garden where the trampled earth once showed Sheila's boot prints. Life continued, now without the shadow of persecution. When the call finally came for me to testify, I drove to the Capitol with a strange sense of calm. The courthouse was imposing, all marble columns and solemn dignity. Inside, the modern courtroom bore little resemblance to Millwood's rustic facilities. Sheila sat at the defense table, no longer in uniform but in a conservative blue suit. Her hair was styled differently, softer somehow, a calculated attempt to appear more sympathetic. But her eyes remained the same, cold, calculating, watching me as I took the stand. The prosecutor guided me through my testimony with professional efficiency. I recounted the harassment, the escalating intimidation, the systematic abuse of power. I described the fear that permeated Millwood, the whispered warnings, the court system that functioned as her personal tool. When shown the collection of tickets that had started it all, I felt oddly detached. Those orange papers that had once seemed so threatening now appeared pathetic, the petty weapons of a bully. During cross-examination, Sheila's attorney attempted to paint me as a disgruntled troublemaker with a personal vendetta. "Mr. Cooper, isn't it true that you repeatedly violated town ordinances and resisted lawful orders?" "No," I replied simply. "I exercised my rights as a citizen and was targeted for doing so." "And yet you launched an extensive investigation into Sheriff Dawson's professional conduct. Why take such extraordinary measures over a few simple tickets?" I looked directly at Sheila as I answered. "Because justice matters. Because no one with a badge should be allowed to terrorize citizens. Because in America, we are supposed to have law enforcement, not tyrants." Her eyes narrowed slightly, the only acknowledgement that my words had landed. The trial continued for 3 weeks. 26 witnesses testified to Sheila's abuses. Former deputies described being ordered to plant evidence. Clerks admitted to destroying complaints on her command. Citizens recounted being targeted for speaking against her. Most damning was the testimony about Sergeant Ray and 2 other individuals who had disappeared after confrontations with Sheila. While no direct evidence linked her to their fates, the pattern was undeniable. On the final day, the jury deliberated for just 4 hours before returning their verdict. The courtroom fell silent as the forewoman stood. On the count of official misconduct, we find the defendant guilty. The litany continued, guilty on 18 of the 27 counts. With each pronouncement, Sheila's posture stiffened further, her face a mask of disbelief. This was not how her story was supposed to end. The judge's sentence came a week later: 15 years in state prison, permanent revocation of all law enforcement credentials, and restitution to victims. As the bailiff led her away, Sheila finally looked broken, not by remorse, but by the simple fact that her power was gone. I returned to Millwood that evening, driving through the quiet streets that no longer held menace. At the town limits, a new sign announced, "Welcome to Millwood, a community of neighbors." Below it, a smaller notice stated that a special election for sheriff would be held the following month. At home, I parked my truck beside my Airstream camper, which now sat legally on my property. No tickets fluttered on the windshield. No patrol cars crept past my fence. Just the peaceful sounds of crickets and distant frogs celebrating the arrival of spring. Inside my renovated house, I stood at the window watching the sunset paint the hills gold. The phone rang, Julia with news that the state had approved a settlement for victims of Sheila's regime. Justice, imperfect but real. Later that evening, I sat on my completed porch steps, breathing in the night air. A car approached slowly, and for a moment, old anxiety flared. But it was only Frank, stopping by with a bottle of whiskey to mark the occasion. To the end of an era, he toasted after settling into a chair beside me. "And the beginning of a better one," I added. We sipped in companionable silence, watching fireflies rise from the grass. After a while, Frank spoke again. "You know, the nomination committee is looking for candidates for the special election. Someone who understands the law but respects people's rights." I chuckled. "I am not a lawman, Frank." "No," he agreed. "You are something better. You are a just man." I did not answer immediately, letting the idea settle like the dew forming on the grass. Perhaps someday. But for now, I was content to be simply a citizen in a town rediscovering its voice, its courage, its freedom. As the moon rose over my land, my peaceful, undisturbed land, I realized that some battles are worth fighting, no matter the cost. Some principles transcend comfort and safety. And sometimes, justice comes not from institutions but from individuals willing to stand when others kneel. I lifted my glass to the night sky, a private toast to Sergeant Ray and all the others who had faced Sheila's wrath before me. "Rest easy," I whispered. "The sheriff's reign is over.